Okay, so in this course, we're going to introduce the concept of a virtual machine and look at virtual machines at a high level in terms of what they are, what they bring, and the different options that you have available on Azure. So we look at, what most companies need in terms of compute capability. We begin with the notion of physical servers. Most companies, and in fact, I would venture to say all companies, have some degree of physical servers available to them. Once you go from physical, now you have this notion of a virtual server. This is where VMs come into the picture. And so over the course of many years, companies would consolidate physical servers onto single larger servers and use virtual machines to create isolation between applications. In the cloud era, we have three major offerings: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Now, if we look at software as a service, this is something like Office 365, where you have applications like Word and Excel available to you on demand. It's the software. You don't have to think about installing the software, managing the software, or the operating systems that power it. We back up a level, we have platform as a service. Now, with platform as a service, you typically have to install and configure the software, but you don't have to worry about where the software is running. So for example, a web application running in Azure is an example of platform as a service. You install the web app, but you don't have to worry about the web server. With infrastructure as a service, you have to worry about the server, but you don't have to worry about the physical implementation that that server runs on. And so Azure Virtual Machines are a portion of the infrastructure as a service component of this. So you as the administrator, you have to worry about the operating system and the applications in the operating system. You do not have to worry about the hardware that the operating system runs on. So Azure Virtual Machines, what are some of the characteristics and some of the things we want to be aware of when we think about Azure VMs? Well, number one, they basically leverage all your existing IT Pro experience. If you're a user of Hyper-V or a user of VMware, then all the concepts for Azure Virtual Machines are going to remain exactly the same. Things like virtual hard disks, virtual memory, CPUs, starting a VM, stopping a VM, saving, cloning a VM. All these basic concepts that you have for configuring and managing virtual machines translate very easily into Azure. So if you're used to Hyper-V or VMware, this is going to seem very straightforward. They support all key server applications. In fact, there's really no difference between Windows running in a VM and Windows running on hardware. So if you can install it on a piece of hardware, with very, very few exceptions, it will run inside a VM just fine. Storage is very simple to manage. You don't have to worry about things like clustering, things like Hyper-V over SMB, things like storage failover, or, to a large degree, even configuring for performance. You simply dictate what you want. You want, a certain amount of storage, a certain number of disks, a certain number of IOPS, and you can configure the virtual machine to meet the need that you have. High availability is built in. VM replication is nothing more than a click of a button, and behind the scenes, Azure will take care of all the underlying work for you. Networking is very simple and straightforward. You simply connect VMs to networks, define what you want those networks to be, and then finally, this concept of a virtual machine translates easily into other Azure services such as VM scale sets. So why would you use a virtual machine in Azure? Well, a couple of reasons. Dev and test. It's an incredibly simple and easy way to spin up a copy of an operating system for the purpose of running testing on code or testing on applications. In many cases, you may not want to spend the time and energy to buy hardware or deploy a new virtual machine in your own data center. You can spin one up in Azure in a matter of minutes, run whatever testing you need, and then delete the virtual machine again for minimal cost. And because Azure is very easy to automate, this is something that you can do on demand over and over again with some simple scripting. You can run your applications in the cloud. If you have a type of application where the load varies quite a bit, maybe on the weekends it's very light, but during the week it's very heavy, you can scale up and scale down on demand in Azure to have a more powerful virtual machine during the week and a less powerful virtual machine on the weekend. And then finally, rather than investing in larger data center footprints, you can simply extend your own data center into Azure. You can connect your network to the Azure network so it all appears as one single network. Users in your office can browse file servers that reside in Azure in the same way that they browse those file servers that reside on your own local LAN. So what are some other things we think about when we look at VMs in Azure? Well, every VM gets a name. And this is a standard 15-character name. This is the same limitation that's on every single computer name you've ever installed. If you want a little bit of trivia, it's because the name was based on the old NetBIOS protocol, which was limited to 15 characters. What's the location of the VM? Right? If your company's in Europe, you want to pick an Azure data center in Europe to hold that VM so you have the lowest possible latency. But you may also want to choose a region that's not near you so you have some global distribution. It's a decision you have to make. What's the size of the virtual machine? Now, this is going to come down to the power the virtual machine has, which ultimately translates into cost. The more powerful the virtual machine you pick, the larger size, the greater the cost. Now, as you're going to see shortly, there's tremendous variance in the amount and types of virtual machines that you can pick. And the key to this is you've really got to understand your workload. If you have a workload that's compute intensive but doesn't require memory, well, there's a type of virtual machine for that. If you have a virtual machine that's memory intensive but doesn't require a lot of processor power, there's a type of VM for that. So we'll go through these VM types here in a little bit, but understand that you really need to understand the needs of your workload to be able to choose the right kind of virtual machine. Then how many can you have? It may seem that Azure is an unlimited trove where you can create as many virtual machines as you want, and it kind of is, but it kind of isn't. Every subscription has a quota, and you can only create up to what your quota is. Now, the default quotas are, for many cases, sufficient for most users, and they vary from region to region. But you need to be aware of them. You can see them on the properties of your subscription, and if you're going to deploy a larger number of VMs, you just need to request a quota extension. Now, in most cases, it's a, click a button and a few hours later it's done. In extreme cases where you want very large quotas, there may be other business agreements that had to be put in place, guaranteed spending, things of that nature, enterprise agreements before Microsoft will actually put those quota limits in place. What image is your VM going to be deployed from? So it could be deployed from a disk that you upload to Azure, or one of the hundreds, if not thousands, of images that are in the Azure Marketplace. Some of these images are free, they come from Microsoft. Some of these images come from third parties, you pay additional licensing for them. Does your VM have any extensions, right? Additional capabilities that you can add, such as desired state configuration, such as antivirus. And then finally, are you going to distribute your VM across different availability sets? Now, we'll talk about availability sets later in this course, but this is a decision you have to make before you deploy your first VM, because once the VM is deployed, you cannot change its availability configuration. Now, this is not replication. Availability has to do with, if you have an application that is load balanced across 3 virtual machines, by configuring an availability set, it ensures those 3 virtual machines within the massive Azure infrastructure don't wind up landing on the same physical machine. So they're distributed to give you better fault tolerance and availability. And then finally, how are you going to back up your virtual machine? And so within Azure, there's something called a Recovery Services Vault. You can configure this anytime, and it will just automatically back up your VMs. The size of the virtual machine is determined by the series of the virtual machine. And so these are the major VM series that are available within Azure. On the low end, we have an A series. On the high end, we have an N series. And again, the cost kind of goes as you would think. The higher the series or the more powerful the series, the greater the cost. And you can see some examples of common use cases here. A D series, the most common type of virtual machine that everybody uses. If you're putting a domain controller, a file server, or a low-end web server, a low-end database server, it's typically a D series. If you're doing something like high-end SQL database work, it might be a G series, which is optimized for memory and storage. If you're doing graphics rendering or analytics or AI that requires a GPU, it might be an N series. So understanding the capabilities of each series is going to go a long way towards identifying the type of VM that you want. And again, you can look at all this on the Azure help documentation. It's well documented on what these series do, what they're good at, and all the example use cases. Now, here's how these series of VMs translate into sizes. So we'll start with Linux. For general purpose Linux VMs, we have B series, D, DS, DV3, AV2, and then A0 to 7. These are all different examples of VM sizes. Now, within each of these, and again, you can look up the exact details of this when you create a VM. It's also available on the Azure website, but they will have varying amounts of memory, varying amounts of disk, and varying amounts of available hard drives and available network adapters. So when you go to create a virtual machine in Azure, you'll see what each of these gives you. So again, understanding exactly what you need going in is key to being able to pick the right type of VM size. Knowing how much CPU you need, how much memory you need, how many disks you need, and how many network interfaces you need. For Windows, again, very, very similar. There are some differences between Linux and Windows. If you look back, you can probably spot some of these if you kind of flick back and forth with this video. But again, every one of these different sizes of VMs has a different combination of network, CPU, disk, and memory. So once you've deployed your virtual machine, how do you access it? Well, there's a couple of different common ways. Number one is all virtual machines have a series of firewall rules that govern access. And these are called network security groups. And network security groups simply do filtering on different types of traffic. So it's basically, a firewall. For Windows VMs, the most common ways you'll access it to manage it are through RDP and WinRM. So you can just do a standard remote desktop session or remote PowerShell remote server manager. For Linux, it's typically going to be over SSH, over secure shell, and that could be using a password authentication or a certificate authentication. And so this is how an administrator will typically gain access to the VM in order to perform whatever basic tasks they need to do, installing applications, running configurations, etc. Now, the purpose of a VM is to run an application of some sort, and so those applications will access in the same way any application accesses over the network. If it's a web application, HTTP or HTTPS. You just have to open those ports on the virtual machine by configuring the network security group. Now, as a small sidebar, we do have a course on networking, and in there we're going to talk about and show you with demos how we configure things like web access to a VM using a network security group. And that could be, other examples might be FTP or any other custom application that you might have. And then the next most common question folks have is, well, if I've got my VM up and running, how do I connect it to the rest of my infrastructure? So I have users and I have other servers and I have just other infrastructure that this VM needs to be a part of. Well, you have a couple of ways you can do this. Azure supports the notion of a site-to-site VPN. That connects your on-premises network to the Azure network, so users in your offices can essentially ping virtual machines running in Azure as if they were on the same local area network. And that's going to allow you to browse file shares, to connect to applications, to replicate data. It becomes a full-fledged member of your infrastructure. You can manage it with Configuration Manager. You could run remote scripts on it, all the things you would do as if it were in your office. You can have multiple Azure networks in multiple regions, and they can connect to each other, and they can have multiple virtual machines on there. So you can build, and it's not just limited to a single VM, you can build an entire VM infrastructure, including domain controllers, member servers, workstations, you name it, all up within Azure. In the case of Active Directory, you can actually take your Active Directory and you can put domain controllers in your offices, but also in Azure. So if you think about this, if I have maybe 20 file servers that reside in Azure, it's a good idea to have a couple of domain controllers to handle authentication. Those domain controllers should be near the file servers, which means those domain controllers should actually run in Azure themselves. So we can actually place domain controllers in Azure on the same network. We can have VPN connectivity, and it just becomes another site within my infrastructure. And then finally, if this is a significant part of your investment, Azure supports something called ExpressRoute. Now, this is a highly optimized, very fast network connection between your local network and the Azure network using a limited number of WAN network providers. So there's a lot of them. There's maybe 40 or 50. I mean, there's hundreds of these in the world, but there's 40 or 50 partners that provide this ExpressRoute connectivity that can give you extremely fast, low latency connections from your office directly into the Azure network. If you're one of these companies that chooses to, take, all my file servers, for example, and put them in Azure as my data center to give me that better, higher, more high performing, faster, more reliable network from where I am directly into Azure. So that's our look at Azure virtual machines and just kind of the high level concepts that are involved when we start thinking about them for the first time. As we move forward, we'll start looking at how we create and manage virtual machines.